Okay, I think we're going here. Welcome back. It's been a while, I know. I've been neglecting my YouTube channel for quite some time. I've actually, been doing a lot of research and writing, so that's kind of where I want to focus myself right now. Not doing as much with the videos, and I'm not sure how much I will be doing in the future. I might do some updates here and there, but for the most part, I've just been writing and researching for the most part. But I thought that I was getting some emails from people. I think that people who know about this channel would figure that I would be reading Lena Nelson's new book, and were wondering what my opinion was on that. So what I'm going to do today is a book review on Lena Nelson's new book. I have it right here. It's America's Youngest Ambassador, The Cold War Story of Samantha Smith's Lasting Message of Peace, Lena Nelson. And here it is. There we go. So I'm going to do a book review on this. It'll probably be in two parts. I'll do just a straightforward review based on the information and what she presents in it. But then I'll do a second part that's going to be more about what she doesn't say in the book, which I think is what speaks the most. So I'll be doing two parts with this. But before I get into it, and I'm not really a book reviewer and I don't do a whole lot of videos here, but I wanted to give a shout out to someone who really does book reviews, and his name's Mitch. He does reviews on a channel called Interesting Books Reviewed, which I'll leave in the description, a link to that. And I encourage everybody to go and check out his channel. He reviews interesting books, basically. Yeah, I mean, that's the name of his channel. And they're interesting to say the least. And a wide range of topics on books that most people are more or less hesitant to read and check out. There's so he does there's a lot of political intrigue and alien stuff, SRA, if you know what that means. I don't know if I really want to say that here, if you can figure out the acronym there. Things of that nature, just a lot of really interesting stuff, and he does a great job reviewing these books. It's one of my favorite channels, if not my favorite channel, on YouTube. So I say go and check that out when you get a chance, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. He does a great job with all of that. I wanted to give some shout outs to other people too, people who have been emailing me, which I completely appreciate. You all know who you are. People who are leaving really good comments on some of these videos. Thank you, and I appreciate it. And some great stuff, great takes and great insight, and I appreciate that a lot. So, with that said, we'll get into the review. So basically, this book comes in at about under 200 pages. It's a very quick read. I've read it twice. I read it in about 3 hours one night the first time, and the second time it took about 4 hours because I was doing a lot of highlighting, as you'll see, and taking notes and going through. So it took a little bit longer the second time. But this is by Down East Books publication, and so basically the book it sticks to the mainstream story of Samantha. It's very biographical. It's does a good job. She does a great job with that. But what she does is that she contrasts it with her growing up in the Soviet Union, and she was, I think, a few years younger than Samantha. And so it's her basically it's half her biography, half Samantha's biography, and it talks about the her perspective of Samantha coming to the Soviet Union in 1983. And so I think it's a interesting way to approach the subject, and she does a good job with that, contrasting the two. I think that there might be a little too much on her end of things. Just my opinion. She probably could have cut down a little bit on that and focused more on Samantha, but she does a good job. She does, and it's a quick read, like I said. and it's a very good biographical story of Samantha. Sticks mostly to the mainstream. She does add in a little bit of background concerning the Cold War. She touches on that a little bit. Some interesting things. She could have gone a lot deeper, obviously, but that's not the point of her book. And so I think she did a good job, and I think it's catered more towards that young teen, young adult type of crowd, which makes sense because it's a story about a girl, a young child going to the Soviet Union, and so it's written more towards that demographic, I would say. But it is a good book overall, and she does add in some things that I didn't even know about, and I pride myself on how much I know about Samantha. But I mean, she has access to Jane, so obviously through that she's going to get a lot more information than most people can get. One section that I thought was interesting that she goes into, and it was one thing that I always had wanted to ask Jane about. It was something, that when I had requested an interview with her, was her trip to the Soviet Union back in 1963, I think it was. I can't remember, 63 or somewhere in that vicinity. When she was at Hollins College, she took a trip there with some other students. And there's some interesting background information on that I was not aware of, and it was something that I would have asked Jane if I ever had the opportunity. And so she talks about where she visited on this trip. One interesting portion is when she goes to Poland, and Khrushchev is speaking there, and she talks about that and how she thought that Khrushchev was looking right at her. She talks about an interesting thing. She took a photo of a sign. I can't remember what it said now. As usual, I'm going off the cuff. This is unscripted, and I'm just going into this. So there's going to be some things that I didn't mark down. But there was a sign that said "Socialism will win" or something like that, which I thought was interesting. There's really the best section of the book that she focuses on the most. I think it takes up 3 or 4 chapters, is her trip to Artek, and that was basically the heart and soul of Samantha. So that makes sense, and that was a really good section. A lot of good stuff there. So basically, it was a decent book. It was a good book. I will say it. There's not many books about Samantha's life out there, so I would think this is the book to get if you want to know about Samantha's life, because she does have a lot of good insight. And she even talks about Jane's background a little bit, and that I thought that was good. It was all stuff that I already knew, and there's a lot more that she could have said about Jane's background that maybe I'll talk about later in this video. But she didn't say a whole lot about Arthur, and I think his background is even more fascinating than Jane's. Not that Jane's isn't. I mean, Samantha was coming from some pretty good pedigree. We'll say that. But yeah, so Arthur, there's a lot of stuff behind him, and I'll probably talk about this later in this video. I'll come back to this. But for the most part, it was a good book, geared towards young adult teens. And one thing I have to say that Lena, she didn't go from the propaganda angle as much as I thought she would, so I thought that was good. There is some in it, and so there is. It leaves the door open for people to read this book, and maybe there's a little bit of a propaganda angle to it from people reading the book and her going out and doing a book tour and doing interviews and things like that, where people will ask questions because of what's going on right now in the world. And I remember seeing one interview that Lena did, where she was asked the question, do you think that we'll have another child come along like Samantha at this time period? So here we go with a propaganda type of question, and Lena answered it by saying that she didn't know. My opinion on that would be that, you don't want a child to have to be doing this. That's my opinion, and I've always stuck to that since I've been looking into this. And there's an ethical issue here, I do believe. So if I was asked that question, I would say that I don't think that a child should be, you know, being put into this situation, which is a very dangerous situation. And that's something that, you know, the book doesn't really talk about how dangerous the situation was that Samantha was getting into, that her parents allowed. And that's a whole other angle that obviously she's not going to take with this book. But I mean, that's a generic review of it for the most part. I would encourage people to go out and buy it if they're interested in Samantha. And if you're on this channel, you probably already know about it. And like I said, I was getting a lot of emails asking about my opinion on the book. And so here we go. So that's the generic review. So the second part of this I'll go into, and it's basically what Lena doesn't talk about or she downplays. And there are two things specifically with Samantha that I think is very important to her story. And one of them is the peace groups, her involvement with that, with which she was involved with the peace groups right up until the day she died. And I'll talk about that, but I'm just bringing it up to speak about it. And the other part is how she downplays Samantha wanting to be a Hollywood actress, which she definitely wanted to. And when she was asked the question, she was always sure, yeah, absolutely, she wanted to be a child actress. And when she was asked if being an actress doesn't pan out, what do you want to do? And she does not say be a peace activist or be involved in politics. She says she wants to be a veterinarian or a hairdresser or a makeup artist and things of that nature. So, and I've said this over and over, that really Samantha didn't want to be what they were trying to make her into, which is, you know, a martyr for peace, which Arthur had brought up in that Boston Globe article in 1985 that I've spoken about before, where he was saying most people would only be happy if Samantha was a martyr for peace for the rest of her life. And they didn't want that. And Samantha didn't want that. And I've talked about this. So she really did want to move into Hollywood, and she was excited about that. And even from August of 1983, there's a newspaper article where she actually says that she's hoping to get onto a TV show, a sitcom, that's on every week, and she couldn't say what it was, but we can find out from Lena's book. And this is one person that I was not aware of, was Al Burton, and Al Burton's involvement with the Smiths, and he actually contacted them in the summer of 1983. So if you could put two and two together, Al Burton worked on Charles in Charge and some other, you know, Different Strokes, I believe, and there's some others. So he was, you know, a Hollywood guy. He actually contacted them, and so what is Samantha referring to in this interview for the paper is probably Charles in Charge. So even back from the summer of '83, and this is something that, you know, so she really wanted that. That's the angle that she wanted to go, even after her trip to the Soviet Union. Right after it, she wanted to be involved in being an actress or on television or whatever. And I think that Lena really does downplay this, and I think that's it's kind of obvious if you look through anything. You know, all of her quotes throughout the years is that she wanted to be an actress, even when she got on Lime Street, and she was hoping that would get picked up and that she would move on and be a Hollywood star. I think that, you know, that's obviously where she wanted to go with things. What was interesting with Lena bringing up Al Burton is that this blew my mind, was that he actually helped with Samantha's speech that she said at the Japanese event that I can't remember the name of it. But when she went to Japan and she gave the granddaughter exchange speech, that Al Burton helped with this speech, which is strange. So he was obviously in getting involved with the peace side of things with them. And I think Arthur also helped her with that speech, but I would think that Arthur was more helping with the grammar and the, that sort of thing, the structure and that. Since he was an English professor, that would make more sense. So it would, you know, put two and two together again. You would think that Al Burton probably was the one who came up with the concept of what they were talking about, which was the year 2001 and computers saving the world, and then the granddaughter exchange and all of that. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, so after that she got moved into the Disney special, and Al Burton again helped with that as he was friends with Al Shapiro, and Shapiro was he was the one that was behind the brains for that political show on Disney where she interviews the Democratic candidates. And Shapiro's an interesting one because he actually was behind what would be considered, I guess, the first reality show. Well, I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the big ones. Was Big Brother. So Shapiro was behind Big Brother, where they're basically watching everything you do, and so it doesn't shock me. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that Samantha was really probably one of the first reality stars. Easily the first child reality star, because basically she was followed everywhere, and when she was in the Soviet Union she was a reality star, and so that quite kind of correlates to what Shapiro did with Big Brother afterwards. But so that was interesting, and as soon as she got into Disney, that was basically it for her. She was definitely trying to move into Hollywood. Charles in Charge, obviously, and then Lime Street. And Burton was the one in charge of Charles in Charge, so obviously he was going to get her on that. And the Lime Street section, and she does say what the official version of how she got chosen for that was this guy Danny Thomason. So when this first started, Robert Wagner had said, "Oh, it was him that brought Samantha to the attention of the producers, as he was a producer as well." And then it switched to, it was Harry Thomason and Lena Bloodworth that discovered Samantha and brought her in. But then it shifted finally to Danny Thomason. Now, Danny Thomason is Harry Thomason's brother. He's a dentist, I believe. But the interesting thing about Danny Thomason is that he is arguably best friends with a guy named Bill Clinton. So Danny Thomason had been friends with Clinton since the late 1970s at least, and he's the one that actually introduced Harry and Linda to Bill Clinton. So when you talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself here because I am going to talk about this more. I want to go back to the peace stuff actually, but anyway, because there were actually accusations that Lime Street were involved in Samantha's plane crash and that they had connections to the government. Well, there's one right there when you talk about Danny Thomason with Bill Clinton. So interesting, but I'll get to that later. I said before, I'm kind of riffing here and unscripted, and I don't know where I'm going to go with this, and I just start talking. And so I'll probably say some very interesting things here today that I haven't talked about in my other videos. Some things that might open your eyes to a little bit more. And already, I'm talking about some of that. But going back to the peace groups, she did not talk about Samantha's involvement with these. And I thought that was interesting. And the only one that she mentions in the entire book is one called Peace Child, which I've brought up before. And Peace Child, as I've said before, it was a musical that was designed by David Wolcombe and Michael Harbottle and Erwin Simmons and a cast of characters that are very peculiar, to say the least. But they fused it with a David Gordon book, or was it Bernard Benson? I get that confused as well. It might have been a Bernard Benson book and David Gordon did the music. I think, yeah, that might have been it. But what it was, and Peace Child, when she mentions Peace Child, it's their involvement with using Samantha in that space bridge that went between Minnesota and the Soviet Union in late 1985. And Peace Child put that on, and it was dedicated to Samantha. So they were, basically using her at that point. So where was I going with this? Peace Child. So Peace Child, it was a musical that had a girl from the Soviet Union and a boy from the United States, and they end up getting together and getting their leaders together to promote peace. And it basically the same story as what Samantha did, just didn't have that other element of another person from the Soviet Union, but it parallels a lot. And what I was going to say was Peace Child started, it was way before Samantha. So this started out in 81, I think, something like that. They got a performance at the Royal Albert Hall that was funded by Buddhists. And then, lo and behold, they are coming to the United States in 1982. And they were going to do their first performance in September, and then for some reason they got pushed back until after Brezhnev died and Andropov came in. And they did their first performance at the Kennedy Center in early December 1982, which puts it right around the time that Samantha wrote her letter. And that's something that I've never been able to pinpoint exactly when she wrote that letter. You really only have clues as to the Time magazine that was, dated 11/22/82, which they usually come out a little before that date, I think, is how the magazines worked. But she was writing her letter at the earliest late November, but probably in December and after this Peace Child musical. So was there some kind of connection there? I don't know. Well, I'm looking into that, and I just won't say much more on that at this point in time, but just aware of Peace Child. And it's interesting because the people behind Peace Child, Michael Harbottle, he was military. I don't know if he was military intelligence, but he took over for Percy Silito in Africa with the diamonds, the diamond smuggling down there. So he was connected there. But his wife, Erwin Simmons, was MI9. And if you're not aware of MI9, they were the intelligence unit in World War II that had to do with captured soldiers behind enemy lines. And what they would do is create these people to go in and not only help the people that were behind enemy lines, but also gather intelligence as well and help them escape. And they would use like front groups, which I thought was very interesting. So they would create these bizarre groups that would be involved in bringing games for the prisoners and things like that. So it's just a very interesting concept there that Erwin Simmons was involved with creating fronts. So just interesting and putting that out there with Peace Child. But so that was the only peace group that Lena mentioned. And there was a section in here. Let me see if I can find it where she says, let me put my glasses on. Sorry. I have definitely, as I get older here. She says, different peace movement causes had written as well when we're talking about writing to Samantha. Their future involvement with the organizations, Jane and Arthur agreed, would depend on Sam. We are not totally opposed to identification between Samantha Smith and world peace. But if it had been left up to Samantha, I think that she would have said, I don't really want to do anything with that. I want to be a Hollywood actress. That's my opinion. And I think that the Smiths were more involved with the peace movement than is being revealed in this book. And in Citizen Diplomats, which I have right here, this is a good book. There we go. It's by Gail Warner, and I got my hand on that. Jeez, I can't get this right. And Michael Schumann. But this is a good book. And in it, Jane is asked if they were involved in the disarmament movement, and she says no, but she was in sympathy with the nuclear freeze movement. And I think that there was more going on there than just sympathy with that movement. And one person I discovered through my research that was involved with nuclear freeze immensely is a guy named H. Burt Richardson, who was friends with the Smiths. And Richardson was a pediatrician, and he worked with Physicians for Social Responsibility and Bridges for Peace from Vermont, which I'm going to talk about. But he was involved in two of these groups. Bridges for Peace were more about, the exchanges between the countries, but Physicians for Social Responsibility was more about nuclear freeze, and that was more about talking about the effects of nuclear war on people. So he was heavily involved in this stuff. And he even greeted Victor Kulagin when Kulagin came from the Soviet Union to go to Samantha's funeral. Who met him? It was H. Burt Richardson. And the Smiths were friends with this guy. So I'm sure friends before Samantha wrote the letter, because he was involved in the Maranacuck community school that Samantha went to. He lived very close to the Smiths. So there's more there than meets the eye. But the other two peace groups that I thought Lena might have mentioned were Bridges for Peace, which is based in Vermont, and the other one was an environmental one. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, and I'm sorry, but it was by this guy Richard Salmon out in Colorado in Estes Park. And this one's interesting because what I found was that it was funded by a guy named Prince Bernhard, and I'm sure some people here know who that is when I bring that up, because he was an ex-Nazi, number one, and number two, he's the one that was one of the founders of what are called the Bilderberg meetings that came up in late 1950s. He was involved with that. So Prince Bernhard and the Bilderbergs are one of those secret meeting groups that happen once a year, where they discuss world geopolitics and things like that, and what's to come for future years, and discussing that. And just to sidetrack back to Bill Clinton was a member of the Bilderbergs, and he was one of the participants right before he became president of the United States. So I know there's some people believe that the Bilderbergs are groomers for that type of thing. So just to put that out there, this guy, you can go look him up, very suspicious character, who started the Bilderbergs, funded this peace group by Richard Salmon out in Colorado. And Samantha was actually still was working with these people when she died. And she had done a commercial, I believe, for that. It might have been for them, but it was put on Ted Turner's TBS, right? It was aired in August of 1985. So she was working with these, and Richard Salmon claims that she was going to be the spokesperson for this group, which is interesting. As she was moving into Hollywood, I don't see how that could have been possible, that she would have agreed to that. And another thing that was strange that Richard Salmon said that I'm not sure Samantha had agreed to, their whole thing was letter writing, children writing letters to world leaders about peace and nuclear war and all of that. And Samantha was supposed to hand deliver these letters to the United Nations in September. It was during their International Year of Children. I can't remember the name of that off the top of my head too. As I'm riffing off of here, I know the name of it, but 1985 was dedicated to the child, the United Nations, and the year that Samantha died, obviously. So very interesting stuff there. And Bridges for Peace, I actually have. Let's see, where do I have that book? Where did I put it? I have it here somewhere. Trust me on this. What do I do with it? Oh, there it is. So I got this book here by Bridges for Peace, and it's Building Bridges, and this was written in, I believe, the late 1980s. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff on them in here. They don't really talk about Samantha in it, which was surprising to me. They do talk about the Samantha Smith Foundation that Jane founded as one of the list of organizations to contact. But there's some really good stuff in here, like their connection with William Coffin Sloan, who was an ex-CIA guy who then became the head of the Riverside Church that was designed by the Rockefellers. That's a whole other thing right there. But they also talk about their connection with Russian Orthodox priests in here as well. A lot of good stuff. But so I have some things on that. So, and when Samantha died, in her obituary, Jane said donations go to Bridges for Peace and Richard Salmon's organization out in Colorado. So she was still involved with these groups right up until the time she died. I'm not sure how much she really wanted to be involved with them. And after she died, obviously they all grabbed hold of her, which happens, I guess. And like I said, with Peace Child, they even call her the poster child in death, and then using her in the space bridge and all of that. And then the guy David Wolcombe actually wrote the children's version of Agenda 21 and all of that, and talked about Samantha in that. So then they use her. So I think this is a very interesting part of Samantha's life that Lena does not even really address. And I would go as far as saying that these groups, that the Smiths were probably involved with them even before Samantha wrote her letter. I'm saying that with confidence. I'm still looking into it, but it seems very likely. And then after she died, obviously Jane was very involved with these, as Peace Child helped fund Samantha Smith Foundation as well. So there's a lot more there than Lena talks about, and I think that when you talk about the usage of Samantha, that if anybody used Samantha, it wasn't, you can't say it was the Soviet Union or whatever, as the Soviet Union were very divided at that point, and obviously when Gorbachev was coming up with perestroika and glasnost and all that, and so it was a heavily divided country, but a lot of people in the Soviet Union were involved with these peace groups, and there's connections there. I think with Michael Harbottle of Peace Child for sure. And so if anybody was using Samantha, it would be more these peace groups, and the NGOs of the United Nations. And I've said this before, and something that I'm definitely digging into, because it's very important to talk about, what she was involved with, and who she was involved with, and the danger of what she was involved with. And this all plays a part into it. And that's a section of Lena's book that she completely ignores. And I think for a reason, and they don't want to talk about this stuff because they don't want Samantha's narrative, her myth, to be tampered with in any way. And if you start talking about that there were peace groups there, and maybe even before she wrote the letter, you start having to question certain things. And one last thing on this topic, as I'm not going to go any further for now, is when Samantha was first contacted, when her letter first appeared in Pravda on April 11th, 1983, there were news station interviewers, journalists that went and interviewed Samantha at this time, and they asked her when she had written the letter, and she said that, and why she wrote the letter, and she said that she had thought that she had written it, she couldn't remember, and she thought maybe last summer is what she said. This is in news articles, you can go look it up. And that she thought it was based on an assignment that her dad Arthur had given to his class, and it's printed in there. So this was the narrative that was being given by Samantha at that time. And then 2 weeks later, they contact Anatoly Dobrynin, and then all of a sudden it's this new narrative that, it was a Time magazine cover and talking to Jane about nuclear war, which I'm not saying didn't happen. Maybe it did, that is, but I'm saying 2 weeks prior to that was not even mentioned. And then all of a sudden 2 weeks later, when she gets the response from Andropov, I almost said Gorbachev, and that's a whole other thing. Like, you don't know who wrote that letter back to Samantha. It could have been Andropov, but it could have been Gorbachev, who was doing a lot of work for Andropov, and he was a protege of Andropov. And even a Smith family friend, Edgar High School, who I'm going to talk about too, I'll get to him. He had actually thrown out that he thought that Gorbachev had written the letter and not Andropov. But I'm not sure why I just was going into that direction. But anyway, so actually, I'll go into the family background. That Lena does talk a little bit about Jane and not much about Arthur. And, she talks about Jane and how she was basically came from money for the most part. What she doesn't talk about, she talks about how, the Reeds were well known. The Reeds were also missionaries, and I believe Christian missionaries in China before that. So something that's not added in there. But there's another section of her family, the Laris side, were wealthy tobacco farmers and had a cigarette brand that was famous and used in movies, and it might have been the official brand of the soldiers in World War II. I think it's been a long time since this was some of the early research that I did about 6 years ago. So I'm kind of trying to remember this stuff. But they were, and I think they also had a television station or a radio station, something like that. So I mean, the Larises were they had some money. The Reeds, like I said, were Christian missionaries, and she does bring up Donald Gosshorn, who, one thing I thought was interesting about him is that he wrote a book on the lineage of Charlemagne, which was bizarre to me. That's a very interesting topic to look into, and I couldn't help but think, was he trying to trace their lineage to Charlemagne? But I'm not sure if that's the case or not, or if he was just interested in that. But he also did some genealogy on the Reeds, and I think he was trying to trace the Reeds all the way back to the Mayflower. So, and I'm not sure if he was successful with that, but the Reeds were a very well-to-do family all the way from colonial times. So, yeah, very, very interesting stuff there. But Arthur's side is really, really intriguing. And the one guy that she didn't mention in her book, but when I started looking into this guy, I was just fascinated. I mean, you could write a whole book on it, and his name is George Hawkinsmith. And Hawkinsmith, the legend goes that his parents were killed by Mexican bandits and that he was raised by the Texas Rangers. And as I looked into that more, I found that there's not, I don't know if that's the entire truth there, because he was still living with his father when he was 18, I think, like that, in Lawton, Oklahoma. So the legend goes that both his parents were killed by Mexican bandits, but I saw that his father was still alive, and they were living in Lawton, Oklahoma at the age of 18. But just a very interesting background to him. But he wound up becoming, he was the first dirigible pilot in the United States, I believe. His license was signed by the Wright brothers, I believe. And so he worked for Goodyear and the Pony Blimp, and made the first voyage in a blimp from California to Catalina Island. Very interesting stuff. He took a blimp ride to Douglas Fairbanks' house, and there's a lot of interesting stuff. And he actually wound up he created a lot of bridges and structures, and the airport in Guyana, I think it was Guyana, the airport there. And so just a very, very interesting character. And interesting, he moved not far from where I live, about 20 minutes or so. And the Hawkinsmiths met the Smiths not far from where I live. And the Smith side, Arthur's grandfather was a engineer for GE and was making turbine engines and things of that sort, and then went into his own business, I think, publishing books that were involved with the Manhattan Project and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But the most interesting thing about this is that Arthur had two really good friends who were in the wedding party of Jane and Arthur's marriage. And this was Robert Fraser and Edgar Heiskell, who I had mentioned previously. And Bob Fraser, who was a childhood friend, I believe, because they both grew up in Morgantown. And Bob Fraser ended up going in to be a political officer. He was working in embassies. He wound up being the first ambassador in Estonia, I believe. but he was involved in. He was actually in London when Peace Child started up. So I wonder if there was some connection there. But so he was involved in that type of stuff, and he wound up being killed in near Sarajevo, I believe, in the Bosnian conflict in the mid 1990s. And it's a very suspicious death. That's something that I've always wanted to look into more, but it would really be sidetracking. But interesting because he had government connections. A good friend of Arthur's who was in their wedding party. And Edgar High School was, I think I mentioned previously about him in another video, that he was Secretary of State, I believe, in West Virginia. And he had actually been involved in a young American political leaders exchange to Soviet Union at some point back in the 1970s, and he talks about this in some videos and things like that. So the Smiths had some connections there, and through Arthur at that point. So there's a lot more going on here as I'm starting to to go off on sidetracks here, because I want to do is get back to Samantha's move to Hollywood, and this I think is very important stuff, and then it ties into the plane crash, which I want to get into what she talks about in the book, because obviously that's the most important thing with what I'm looking into and what most people think that I would be talking about, and I will get to that. But the move into Hollywood and how strange it was, a strange connection to Lime Street. Al Burton could have been involved in that too, because he worked with Linda Bloodworth on a show called Mary Hartman. So he was familiar with Linda, so there could have been something there with Al Burton. But it was just strange how she got into Lime Street and then was chosen over hundreds of other professional child actors. And so it's very strange. And there's some things that you can go into there with Robert Wagner's connections that he had. Just right before he was scouting locations for Lime Street, he was at Ronald Reagan's inaugural ball in January of 1985, and he and Jill St. John were right there next to Reagan when he's doing his speech at the end of it. I mean, so a lot of connections there, and obviously with Henry Kissinger, Wagner has some connections there as well. So there, when you started talking about Lime Street and the government connections that these accusations were talking about, it's all there. Trust me on that. I mean, I've already talked about Bloodworth's and now Robert Wagner. One of the writers on the show was E. Jack Kaplan, who was a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter. The list goes on with Lime Street, with there's government connections there. So it's a very strange, it's a strange thing. I won't get into too much of that here, but we'll talk about how the Smiths wound up on the plane. So this is an interesting part of Lena's book, and I wasn't aware of this. And she brings it up, and it's Arthur's day planner, which I was thinking it's a miraculous that this thing survived the plane crash. It would have had to have survived the plane crash. It's miraculous anything did. The Lime Street script was one that survived it and was sitting on top of the debris. I mean, that just sounds bizarre to me. But the day planner was another one that obviously it survived this crash, and Jane's had it since 1985. And Lena publishes the plane trip itinerary from the day planner. And in it, she talks about that they were scheduled on flight 1790. So this is the first time I've ever heard about this, and it was an interesting thing to include in the book. And it makes me wonder why this had never been talked about before. It would have been, something that would have made this even more bizarre, that they were not even scheduled to be on flight 1808, and they were in fact on flight 1790 apparently. And I can find nothing about flight 1790, but it's my job to, and it's something that I'll be looking into and figuring this out. But anyway, that plane, so they either had to have missed that flight or it was canceled. And at this point, we don't know. And Lena says we'll never know. But it's strange that Jane, and there goes the ice cream truck, if you can hear that. Yeah. So it's interesting that Jane doesn't know. I would have thought that that if Arthur and Samantha had missed that flight or it was canceled, they would have phoned her. And if she wasn't home at the time, I can't imagine that they did not have an answering machine, given who Samantha was and her career, and that they wouldn't want to be missing phone calls, and they would have something. They would have left a message at least, or have gotten in touch with her and told her that they missed the flight or it was canceled. I think that's odd to me anyway. But I'll look into that. But what it made me do was go back into the NTSB report and look for this 1790, and it's not listed in there at all. But while going back through it, sorry, this is distracting me. Got to get some ice cream. As I was going back through it, I found that I had overlooked the fact that they had the NTSB report talks about 2 flights on Sundays, one going from Boston straight to Bangor, and one going from Boston to Augusta, Waterville, Bangor, that route. So it only talks about those 2. But Lena says that there were 2 flights that would do the Boston to Augusta or Auburn, Waterville route. And so if that's the case, their Bar Harbor had 3 flights going at this point. But anyway, it gets extremely, extremely confusing. But the odd thing is, when I was talking about before how they switched the numbers of the flight, that's what I thought. Because Fraunhofer and Owen are told before they get back to Boston that they were going to be flight 1755. And 1755 was the straight Boston to Bangor flight. That's what they were going to be flying. But they were told at the last minute that, no, you're going to be flying flight 1808 instead. And that's the one that Samantha and Arthur were ticketed on. And so they switched the plane and pilots is what wound up happening here at the last second. They claim it was because of delays, but all planes were being delayed. Why would they have to switch the flights if all planes are being delayed? Everybody's being delayed. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it's a very confusing thing now. But it's something I'm going back in and looking into, and I'm going to actually contact the records management division in Washington, D.C. for the NTSB hearing and whatever else we've got on that, because this is very odd that they switched the pilots and plane at the last second here. And there's a news article where they actually say that it was very unusual to do, and that's all they say. But then they say it should not have affected the pilots at all, because Fraunhofer and Owen were excellent pilots and flew this route many times, and that's what they say in this. And so it's a very strange thing. But her bringing up the day planner in 1790, that it makes things a little bit more strange, and I kind of thank her for that, because it did make me see that they didn't switch flight numbers, they switched planes and pilots here, and that's what they did at the last second, which is very, very bizarre and unusual, like NTSB said. So it adds a bit more intrigue in there. So, but another piece of this is that Lena continues to say the narrative that Arthur and Samantha were flying back to Maine to pack and then go to Hollywood. And this was what was repeated in the mainstream, and she talks about it here and saying what I thought was very odd, that they were getting tired of the long days. I mean, what do you expect being an actress on a TV show? And they had a 5-day break while they were in London. So it's very strange that they would say that they were tired of the long hours and this and that, and that's why they wanted to go home. But the point being here that I'm going to make, and I'm not sure I've talked about this before, is that the Smiths were never scheduled to go back on August 25th. This was not something that was in the itinerary of their scheduled trip to Europe. They were supposed to go to London, then they were going to Switzerland, and then it was to Amsterdam. And this is brought up in Robert Wagner's book, where he talks about the fact that they were supposed to go back, pack for a few days, and then fly back and meet him in Switzerland. And Robert Wagner says this. Ray Austin also corroborates this. Harry Thomason, they all talk about this, that they were coming back to Switzerland. And this trip was never intended. So it was a last-minute trip. And they were told by the producers that it was okay to go pack for a few days if you want to take a break, because Samantha wasn't going to be in the next episode, which was the Swiss Watch and Wait in Gstaad, Switzerland. You could fly back and then come back. But the thing is, so this was an impromptu trip as well. They weren't scheduled to go back. And so, and also they didn't pay for the tickets. And this is the interesting thing. So this trip was not planned, and it wasn't in Colombia's budget to have paid for this trip back. So they would have had to pay for it on their own to go back to Maine. And that's the interesting thing, that they didn't end up paying for it, and it wound up being charged to Colombia to their company credit card. I think it was Robert Wagner or Ray Austin who said that was okay to do, to put it on the Columbia card. And no, you don't have to pay for it to go back. So I'm thinking that Arthur probably didn't want to pay for this trip out of his own pocket to go back. So there was some kind of agreement there to get them to go back, that they would pay. They'd put the charge on Columbia. And Robert Wagner brings this up in his memoir, Pieces of My Heart, I believe it's called, and I have that over here too. And he talks about that Columbia, after the fact, actually tried to sue Jane Smith for the cost of those tickets, which is, that's, pretty ghoulish, I guess. But what that says is that trip was not ever coordinated with Columbia. They didn't authorize that trip. They didn't authorize them to pay for that trip on the Columbia card. And they decided to go after Jane for it. And I guess the case was dropped or whatever. I don't know. This is in Robert Wagner's book. You can go read it. And so it just adds in a whole lot more to what we're talking about here. It's just a bizarre thing. It's all bizarre. How they even wound up going back, how they got onto flight 1808 with that particular plane and pilots, and then the added passengers to Augusta or Auburn where the plane crashed. Very strange stuff. So all this being said, that's obviously Lena was not going to go into that side of things in her book, but I'm bringing up a lot more here than I have in previous videos. But understand this, that I'm not making this stuff up. This is corroborated by people on Lime Street, and it's talked about in Robert Wagner's book, that it was not a trip to just go back and pack and move to Hollywood. And Jane had said they weren't moving to Hollywood until like mid-September anyway, was the plan, I guess. It was mid-September or to September latish, but then she talks about how they wanted to be moving before the start of the school year, which was going to be impossible anyway. And that's a whole other thing I wanted to talk about, was Jane's camping trip, which was odd timing for her to do that. If they were waiting on the call to go to London, and they got it earlier than expected, they would have not had come back in a time frame that would have allowed them to go back to Hollywood before the start of the school year anyway. So just some very strange stuff going on there in her book. But I think that I've said most of what I wanted to say here. I'm probably forgetting some things. So I've said a lot more than I have in my previous videos. There's still a lot more to this than I've ever revealed. And I'm trying to write, and I do have several chapters done. And I want to get this book done soon, sooner than later. But it is hard, especially with a full-time job and kids. And I play in about 6 bands, literally. And it's tough to keep up with all of this stuff. But I wanted to get a book review out on Lena's new book, and I talked a lot more than I probably expected. But so those are pretty much my thoughts. And if anybody has any thoughts of their own on the book and share them, I'd love to hear them. And leave comments. You can share the video. Hopefully I'll do some more videos. I don't know if I will or not. We'll see what happens with that. I'm really trying to focus on and doing research, and I've been working on something else that a little birdie's talking here, that there might be a new book that about Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood coming up. You didn't hear it from me, but no. Look forward to seeing this. There's a new book coming out that should come out soon, and wow, let's see what else are we talking about here. Oh yeah, and go check out Interesting Books Reviewed. He does a much better job than I do with reviewing books. He is one of the most interesting channels on YouTube, and just a great guy in general. So I'm glad I got to know him, and I encourage you. And I'll put the description in the or not the comments, but the description. And let's see. I know I'm forgetting something that I wanted to say, but I'm just going to drop it off here because this has been going on for a long time, and hopefully you stuck with this. This was intended to be a review of Lena's book, and I did review a lot of that, and then brought up some interesting things that were included in the book, and some of my perspectives on Samantha and what was going on there. And I'm continuing to work hard on it, and I'll try to keep you guys updated. But hopefully you like this video, and leave comments, emails. I love getting emails, even if they're critical, and I know some of them are, and that's fine. And I wind up having to say, because a lot of people think that I'm discrediting Samantha by things that I'm saying and doing here regarding the letter and her importance and all that. I do not discount who Samantha was at all, ever would I. It is amazing what this girl did. Doesn't matter if it was grassroots or if she was screened or handpicked or whatever. When she went to the Soviet Union, that was not scripted. The things she had to do there and how she had to handle the people, the press, like all of this is incredible. And not 1 in a million kids, 1 in 10 million kids could have done what she did. And I do not discount that whatsoever. And she was an amazing child. But there comes a price with getting involved in things that are much more dangerous than realized. And that's kind of what I'm showing here. And I think that a lot of people have a very naive view of what's going on with things, and that's fine. And I'm not knocking peace groups or people who want peace, but I think you need to look into these types of things with a deeper lens. And I know there's a lot of good people involved with these organizations and organizations that I'll bring up. And that's one side of this. See, I'm talking all about the radical left, using Samantha and all this, but there's a whole other side of this on the radical right. So, and I have not talked about that. So maybe I'll do a video on that. And speaking of Mitch, he's done some really great stuff for me, helping me on that end of things. So I thank him for that, and I appreciate it. But all right, I'm talking way too much, and I'm going to end it here, and I'll talk to you later. All right, bye.